There is a question that intelligence agencies almost never answer honestly. Not how they kill someone. The how is eventually reconstructed by journalists, by analysts, by the slow accumulation of leaked documents and deathbed confessions. The question they never answer is simpler than that, more disturbing than that. How long were they willing to wait? In the summer of 2008, a man was sealed inside a wooden box and lowered into the ground in Damascus, Syria. He was not dead. He was a trained operative carrying a suppressed rifle, a water supply, a chemical waste pouch, and a single photograph of the man he had been sent to kill. He would remain in that box for 72 hours, 3 full days, underground, alone, in a city where discovery meant not arrest, but disappearance. His name has never been confirmed by any government. His nationality has never been officially acknowledged. The intelligence file connected to what he did in Damascus that summer has never been declassified. But the man he was sent to kill, that part is documented. The weapons network that man controlled, that part is documented. And the consequences of what was set in motion in that cemetery, those are still unfolding. This is what the evidence suggests happened. This is the operation that certain governments have spent considerable effort ensuring you would never fully understand. His designation, in the partially reconstructed operational records that have surfaced in European intelligence journals, is simply Aleph. He was 34 years old in the summer of 2008, former Special Forces. Then a transfer, the kind that doesn't appear in any official personnel record, into Mossad's Kidon unit, the Direct Action Division, the one that handles operations where the objective cannot be achieved from a distance. Aleph had completed 2 previous operations in Europe, both successful, both clean, neither of them anything like what he was being asked to do now. What made Aleph different from the other candidates considered for this mission was not his marksmanship. His file indicates that was exceptional, but not uniquely so within the unit. What made him the selection was a single quality that his handlers had noted across multiple evaluation reports, written over several years, in language that was clinical but unmistakable. He could be still. Not physically still, any trained operative can control movement. Psychologically still, the ability to remain in a confined, dark, sensory-deprived environment without the micro-decisions, the subtle, escalating anxiety, the compounding need for resolution that causes trained people to do untrained things. His evaluators had tested this under controlled conditions. 48 hours of isolation, simulated confinement, monitored physiological response. He had performed within acceptable parameters, but the evaluations had been conducted in a controlled facility outside Tel Aviv, not in a cemetery in Damascus. Not with Syrian military intelligence running active surveillance networks 3 streets away. Not with the knowledge that the man above him, walking past the grave, could at any moment stop and look down. There is a significant difference between performing under controlled conditions and performing when the conditions are trying to kill you. That difference had not been fully tested. To understand why anyone was willing to put a man in the ground, literally, in the capital city of a hostile nation, you have to understand who they were trying to reach. The target's operational name in Mossad files has been partially reconstructed as a Syrian brigadier general. For the purposes of this account, we'll use the designation that appears in the reconstructed intelligence assessments. General Rahimi. He was not a symbolic target. He was not chosen for political effect or for the message his death would send. He was chosen because he was a functional node in a weapons pipeline that Israel's military planners considered one of the most dangerous active logistical operations in the region. In the 2 years following the 2006 Lebanon War, Hezbollah had been rebuilding. Not slowly, not cautiously. Faster than Israeli military intelligence had projected, with more sophisticated hardware than it had possessed before the war, and with a level of Iranian coordination that suggested the rebuilding was not improvised recovery but deliberate strategic rearmament. Anti-tank guided missiles, extended range rockets, communication systems sophisticated enough to survive active Israeli jamming operations. All of it moving through Syria. all of it moving, in one way or another, through channels that Rahimi controlled. He was the approval mechanism, the coordinator between Syrian military intelligence, Iranian Revolutionary Guard logistics advisors, and Hezbollah's external procurement division. He did not pull triggers. He signed off on shipments. He made introductions. He ensured that hardware that needed to cross borders crossed them without interference from Syrian customs, Syrian military checkpoints, or Syrian officials who might otherwise have created complications. By early 2008, Mossad's collections division had built a detailed profile on Rahimi over approximately 14 months of surveillance. What that profile revealed was a man who had survived this long, not through luck but through genuine operational discipline. He did not use mobile phones for sensitive communication. He rotated meeting locations with a consistency that suggested formal training in counter-surveillance. He varied his routes, his vehicles, his schedule, not randomly, which creates its own patterns but with a practiced irregularity that was significantly harder to map. Israeli intelligence had made 2 previous attempts to establish a surveillance position close enough to Rahimi to create an actionable targeting opportunity. Both had been quietly abandoned before they became compromises. Not because Rahimi had detected them, there is no evidence he had, but because the operating environment around him was dense enough that the risk of exposure had, on both occasions, crossed the threshold that Mossad's operational planners considered acceptable. He had not survived by finding his enemies. He had survived by operating in spaces where his enemies could not easily follow. That was the problem that 11 weeks of planning had failed to solve. Damascus in 2008 was not a permissive environment for any kind of extended Israeli intelligence operation. Syrian military intelligence, the Mukhabarat, maintained one of the most aggressive domestic surveillance networks in the Middle East. Neighborhood informant systems, systematic monitoring of foreign nationals. In certain districts, particularly those near military facilities, the surveillance density made conventional insertion approaches essentially unusable. You could not park a vehicle and wait for 3 days. The vehicle would be flagged within hours. You could not rent an apartment on short notice without documentation that would create a traceable record. You could not establish a rooftop or elevated position. Rahimi's consistent route, the one predictable element in an otherwise disciplined security posture, passed through a neighborhood where any unfamiliar presence at height would be reported before the first day ended. Every conventional approach had been mapped and eliminated. What remained was not a plan. Not yet. It was an observation made by a junior analyst on the Syrian desk, in a planning session that had already run 3 hours past its scheduled end, delivered in the tentative register of someone who expects to be dismissed. Rahimi's route passed within 40 meters of a cemetery, and in that cemetery, burials happened with enough regularity, 3 to 5 per week, that the presence of a fresh grave, a groundskeeper, a newly placed mourner, or a funeral preparation team created no anomaly whatsoever. The analyst's question was simple, almost too simple for the room it was asked in. Could you put someone in the ground before the target arrived? The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then the objections began. And there were serious ones. Air supply, thermal detection risk, waste management, communication from a sealed underground position, the psychological viability of extended confinement in a hostile environment, the absence of any reliable extraction window once the shot was taken. Any one of those problems was significant. Together, they looked less like a plan and more like a sequence of ways to lose an operative in a foreign cemetery with no plausible cover story and no recovery option. The proposal was noted. It was not pursued. It was set aside for 3 weeks, and then something changed. Something that made the people who had dismissed the Coffin plan pick it back up again, and this time look at it differently. What Mossad had just learned about Rahimi's next operation made every other option on the table look like the riskier choice. There is something that intelligence agencies understand about complex operations that rarely makes it into public accounts. The most dangerous moment in any operation is not the execution. It is the planning phase, specifically, the point where the people doing the planning have invested enough time, enough resources, and enough institutional credibility that the question of whether to proceed stops being an objective assessment and starts being something closer to momentum. 11 weeks in, the Rahimi operation had reached that point. What the junior analyst's observation had identified was not a solution. Not yet. What it had identified was a category of approach that hadn't been eliminated, and in a planning process where everything else had been, that was enough to keep it alive. The support team assigned to develop the Coffin concept worked for 2 weeks before they came back with anything resembling a viable technical proposal. What they found, in the process of that development, was that the problems were real but solvable. Every single one of them had an engineering answer. The question nobody had fully asked yet was whether the sum of those engineering answers added up to something a human being could actually survive. Air supply was solved first. A compressed reservoir embedded in the base lining of the box, providing approximately 90 hours of filtered oxygen with a passive CO2 scrubbing layer. Enough for the operational window with a margin that looked comfortable on paper. Waste management was solved with a sealed chemical containment system, compact enough to pass a surface inspection. Hydration was solved with a sealed bladder, 4 liters, delivered through a bite valve positioned at the mouth level. No food. The caloric sacrifice was considered acceptable given the alternatives. Communication was the hardest problem, and the solution was the one that would later prove to be the operation's most significant structural vulnerability, though nobody in the planning room understood that yet. A single fiber optic thread, thinner than a human hair, running from the interior of the box through the soil to a connection point inside a drainage channel 40 meters away. Text reception only. Aleph could receive instructions. He could not transmit except through a vibration sensor embedded in the box wall, pre-coded to 3 signals. 1 pulse, status nominal. 2 pulses, abort requested. 3 pulses, emergency extraction required, 3 signals, for 72 hours of potential scenarios. The planning team had discussed whether this was adequate. The conclusion they reached was that it was not ideal, but operationally acceptable. What they did not discuss with sufficient seriousness was what happened if the line went down. That omission would matter. The optical element was a 3mm fiber lens positioned in the side wall of the box at the ground level, giving Aleph a fixed field of view of approximately 18 degrees, covering the section of road where Rahimi's vehicle was expected to pass. The lid was designed to open from the inside, silently, in under 4 seconds. The weapon was a suppressed precision rifle, pre-zeroed for a maximum engagement distance of 60 meters. The exit plan required Aleph to be back inside the box within 12 seconds of the shot. The extraction team would arrive within a 4-hour window following confirmation. On paper, the system worked. In the planning room, the system worked. There was one member of the planning team, a woman, a senior logistics coordinator whose name does not appear in any public record, but who is referenced in the reconstructed operational assessment as LE, who raised a concern that was noted, discussed, and ultimately set aside. Her concern was not technical. It was human. She had worked 3 previous Kedon operations. She understood what happened to people in confined, high-stress, sensory-deprived environments over extended periods. Not in the first 12 hours. Training covered that. Not even in the first 24. What happened between hour 30 and hour 60 was what she was concerned about. The brain, deprived of external input for long enough, begins generating its own. Not hallucination, necessarily. Something subtler and more operationally dangerous. A slow drift in threat assessment. A tendency to interpret ambiguous sensory information. A sound, a vibration, a shadow across the lens, as a confirmation of whatever fear is currently dominant. She had seen it in a previous operation. An operative in a concealment position for 40 hours who had made a targeting decision based on a confidence assessment that later analysis showed was almost certainly compromised by cumulative stress. The operation had succeeded. The assessment error had not produced a catastrophic outcome. But Elle's point was that it had been close. She proposed a hard limit, 48 hours maximum in the box. If the target had not appeared within 48 hours, Aleph would be extracted and the operation would be aborted. The operational planners reviewed the proposal. The timeline for Rahimi's expected route through the area gave a 72-hour window of viable opportunity. A 48-hour limit eliminated the final 24 hours of that window, the period that the surveillance assessment considered the highest probability window for target appearance. The proposal was rejected. Elle noted her objection in the operational record. The operation proceeded with a 72-hour limit. Aleph was briefed fully, including Elle's concern, including the decision to override it. His response, according to the handler who conducted the briefing, was brief. He said he understood. He did not say he agreed. That distinction was not followed up on. The insertion plan was built around a real death. An elderly Syrian man with no surviving close family had died in a village outside Damascus. A Mossad support asset, someone with established access to local funeral logistics and documentation systems, arranged for the burial to occur at the target cemetery. The paperwork was genuine. The body was genuine. The small group of mourners contained 2 members of the support network. The coffin carrying Aleph arrived in a secondary vehicle in the funeral procession. It was transferred by 4 men who appeared to be cemetery workers and were not. The burial occurred at 4:47 in the afternoon. Standard depth, standard procedure. By 5:15, the cemetery was quiet. What the insertion team did not know, what could not have been known from the surveillance conducted in the weeks prior, was that the Mukhabarat had 3 days before the planned insertion quietly expanded their monitoring activity in the district. Not because of anything connected to Rahimi, not because of anything connected to Mossad. A completely unrelated incident, a domestic political matter involving a Syrian official whose residence was 2 streets from the cemetery, had prompted a routine increase in neighborhood surveillance density. Additional informants, additional vehicle monitoring, an increased Mukhabarat foot presence in the surrounding streets. Nothing that would flag a funeral as suspicious, but enough that the operating environment Aleph was being inserted into was measurably more dangerous than the environment the plan had been designed for. The support team on the ground had noted the increased activity. They had assessed it as manageable. They had not escalated the assessment to the planning team in Tel Aviv because the insertion window was narrow, and the communication protocol for non-critical updates did not require immediate escalation. The word manageable would be reconsidered later. Aleph had been underground for 31 hours when the fiber optic communication line went silent. Not slowly, not with warning. One moment the line was active, a status update had been received 11 minutes earlier. The next moment, nothing. The support team's first assessment was equipment failure, a connection fault at the drainage channel endpoint. Something fixable within an hour if they could get physical access to the channel without attracting attention. The second assessment came 40 minutes later when a ground asset reported what had happened. A municipal road crew, performing unscheduled maintenance on the drainage infrastructure 2 streets away, had excavated directly through the fiber line. They had no idea what they had cut. To them, it was an unmarked cable in a drainage channel, indistinguishable from dozens of other infrastructure threads running beneath that neighborhood. The support team now had no contact with Aleph, no status confirmation, no abort capability, no way to push updated intelligence to an operative who was lying 1 meter underground with a weapon in a city that had just become more dangerous than the plan had accounted for, and who had no way of knowing any of this. What Aleph did know, and what the support team did not yet know he knew, had changed everything about how he understood this operation. At hour 28, 3 hours before the communication line went silent, something had appeared in his 18-degree field of view that was not in the operational plan. A vehicle had stopped on the road directly within his line of sight, not passing through. Stopped, engine running. 2 men had stepped out. Aleph had moved to the lens. 70% was not enough. The protocol was explicit. Confirmation required meeting a minimum of 4 physical identifiers from the target profile: height, gait, a slight irregularity in the left shoulder, the result of an old injury documented in Mossad's medical intelligence file on Rahimi, and a specific habitual gesture, the way Rahimi reportedly touched the left side of his jaw when stationary and in conversation. Aleph had 2 of the 4, maybe 3. The shoulder was ambiguous at this distance and angle. He did not move toward the lid. Then the second man turned, and Aleph saw what he was carrying: a child, a small child, no older than 3, held against the man's chest, face tucked into his shoulder, apparently asleep. The first man finished whatever he was looking at on his phone, said something. The second man, the one with the child, nodded. They both got back in the vehicle. It pulled away. Aleph stayed at the lens for 4 minutes after the vehicle disappeared, running the confirmation criteria again in his mind, as if repetition would resolve what observation had not. He could not confirm the target. He could not rule him out. What he could confirm was that if he had been at 75% instead of 70%, if the shoulder irregularity had been 1 degree more pronounced, if he had moved to the lid on instinct rather than protocol, he would have taken a shot at a man holding a sleeping child on a public street in Damascus. He filed that thought away in the part of his mind where operatives store the things they cannot afford to process in the field. He sent 1 pulse, status nominal. 11 minutes later, the line went silent. Hour 34. Aleph had been running on the assumption that the silence was temporary. Equipment fault, connection issue at the channel endpoint, something the support team would resolve within a few hours and the line would return. By hour 36, he had revised that assumption. The line was not coming back, not on its own, which meant either the support team was working to restore it, in which case he waited, or something had happened to the support team, in which case the entire operational framework around him had collapsed, and he was alone in a box in Damascus with no extraction plan and no way to communicate that fact to anyone. He had no way to determine which of those 2 situations was true. He ran his resources, air, adequate. The reservoir gauge, readable by touch in the dark, indicated approximately 40 hours remaining, sufficient. Water, low. He had been rationing since hour 20, extending the 4-liter supply beyond its intended duration. His mouth was dry in a way that was becoming difficult to separate from anxiety. Physical condition. His legs had moved from discomfort to a deep, persistent numbness that he was monitoring with clinical attention. Circulation compromise was a real risk at this duration. He ran the in-box movement protocol, micro-contractions, isometric pressure against the walls, every 40 minutes. Mental condition, he did not assess this directly. He assessed it obliquely by checking whether his thinking was sequential and whether his recall of the operational parameters was accurate. Both were intact, for now. Hour 41. A sound above him that was not footsteps and not a groundskeeper. Voices. 2 people, close, speaking in Arabic. He caught fragments. Not a conversation about anything concerning. A mundane exchange, something about a family, a name he didn't recognize, directions to somewhere. They stood almost directly above him for approximately 6 minutes. Aleph did not breathe differently, did not shift, did not move his hand toward the 2-pulse abort signal, but the thought was there. For the first time since insertion, the thought of 2 pulses was not abstract. He let it exist, he did not act on it. The voices moved away, hour 47, a vehicle in his field of view, wrong type, wrong approach angle, a small commercial truck, nothing matching Rahimi's profile. It passed without stopping. Hour 49, a man on foot crossing his field of view at the far edge of the 18 degrees. Older, civilian, carrying something. Gone in seconds. Hour 51. Nothing. This was the period that L had been concerned about. Not the dramatic moments, the voices above, the vehicle at hour 28, the ambiguous confirmation. Those moments had a shape. They demanded assessment and response, and the demanding of response kept the mind functional. It was the nothing that was dangerous. The unbroken, undifferentiated silence and darkness between events. The way the mind, given nothing to process, begins to process itself, begins to audit its own assumptions, begins to find, in the absence of external threat, the internal ones. Aleph was aware this was happening. The awareness did not stop it. He found himself returning to the vehicle at hour 28, reconstructing it, questioning his 70%. Had it been higher than he'd assessed, and he had talked himself down out of excessive caution? Had the child created a hesitation that compromised his judgment in the opposite direction, making him less likely to confirm because confirmation would require a decision he didn't want to make? He did not know. He could not know. And in the absence of the communication line, there was no one to ask. Hour 54. Aleph's air gauge indicated approximately 36 hours remaining. He was inside the final operational third. His water was gone. His legs were a problem he was managing rather than solving. And the operational window, 72 hours from insertion, was now 18 hours away from closing. If Rahimi did not appear in the next 18 hours, the extraction team would come. The operation would be aborted, and the man who had been lying in this box for 3 days would have to climb out of the ground with nothing to show for it except the knowledge that he had not broken. He was not sure at hour 54 whether that would feel like success or something else entirely. Hour 56. A vehicle entered his field of view. He was at the lens before he consciously decided to move. The vehicle stopped, not passing, stopped. Engine off this time. One man stepped out. Aleph ran the criteria. Height confirmed. Rahimi's file placed him at 178 centimeters. The man stepping out of the vehicle matched. Gait, the files described a slight asymmetry, a barely perceptible favoring of the right side, consistent with an old knee injury. The man crossed toward the far edge of Aleph's field of view, and Aleph tracked the movement for 11 full steps. Confirmed. Shoulder irregularity, the man paused, turned partially toward the road. The left shoulder sat fractionally lower than the right, the kind of thing that is invisible unless you have been looking at photographs and physical assessments for weeks. Confirmed. 3 of 4. Aleph waited. The man stood still for a moment, looking at something beyond Aleph's field of view. Then he reached up with his left hand, touched the left side of his jaw, held it there for 2 seconds. 4 of 4. Aleph moved his hand to the lid release and stopped, because there was a second person, not visible yet. But he could hear a second set of footsteps, not from the vehicle, from somewhere else, approaching from the right edge of his field of view. A second person he had not seen, could not identify, could not assess. The protocol for a secondary presence within the engagement zone was to hold, confirm isolation of target before action. The footsteps slowed. A second man entered the edge of his field of view. Older, civilian dress. He approached Rahimi, shook his hand, said something brief. Rahimi responded. The second man nodded and walked away. The entire exchange lasted 40 seconds. Rahimi stood alone on the street. Aleph's hand returned to the lid release. He ran the confirmation criteria one more time. Not because he needed to, because the protocol required it, and because the operation had already produced one moment where he had nearly acted on incomplete information, and he was not going to produce a second. Height, gait, shoulder, jaw, 4 of 4. He had his target, alone, 31 meters away, on a quiet street in Damascus at 11:22 in the morning, with the ambient sound of a city going about its business covering everything. The lid opened in 3.8 seconds. The shot was taken at 11:23 in the morning. One round, suppressed. At a distance later, assessed at 31 meters. Rahimi was dead before he reached the ground. Aleph was back inside the box in 8 seconds. The lid was closed. He sent one pulse, and then he lay in the dark, in the same position he had occupied for 56 hours, and waited, because the extraction team was not in position. Not because of negligence, not because of a planning failure in the conventional sense, because the road crew that had severed the communication line 31 hours earlier had also, without any awareness of what they were doing, partially obstructed the primary vehicle route that the extraction team needed to use. An alternate route existed. The extraction team had identified it within 2 hours of the obstruction being reported. But the alternate route added 19 minutes to the approach and passed through a checkpoint that required documentation the team had not originally prepared for this access point. The documentation was prepared. It held. The checkpoint passed without incident, but the timeline had shifted, and Aleph, with no communication line and no way to receive updated instructions, did not know any of this. What he knew was that the extraction window had opened and no one had come. He knew that Rahimi's body was on a public street 31 meters from a cemetery. He knew that Syrian emergency services would have been called within minutes of the shot. He knew that Mukhabarat response to an assassination of this profile, a senior Syrian military intelligence liaison, would not be slow or disorganized. He knew that the longer he remained in the box after the shot, the more the environment above him was filling with exactly the kind of security presence that made extraction dangerous. He sent one pulse. Status nominal, he did not send 2 pulses. He had made his decision about 2 pulses somewhere around hour 51, in the long silence between events, without fully acknowledging to himself that he had made it. He was not going to abort after the shot. Whatever came next, he was going to wait it out. Above him, the neighborhood was doing what neighborhoods do when something violent and inexplicable happens without warning on a quiet street. It was filling with people. The extraction team, approaching on the alternate route, picked up the changed environment on their ground assets report 14 minutes after the shot. More foot traffic. Syrian security vehicles visible 2 streets over. A Mukhabarat response unit, faster than the planning estimate had projected, a function of the increased surveillance density that the planning team in Tel Aviv had received as a manageable assessment, already establishing a perimeter. The perimeter was not at the cemetery. Not yet. The extraction team had a window. It was narrower than planned. It was closing. The 4 men who arrived at the cemetery arrived under cover of the afternoon burial, a real funeral, a real family, real grief that had nothing to do with any of this. They moved to the grave with the practiced efficiency of cemetery workers. They opened it in 11 minutes. Aleph emerged into daylight for the first time in 58 hours. He was dehydrated, physically depleted, and according to the account later reconstructed by the operational debrief team, completely silent. He was dressed in mourner's clothing before the grave was closed. He was in the vehicle and moving through Damascus traffic within 4 minutes of extraction. He did not speak during the drive. The Mukhabarat perimeter reached the cemetery entrance 17 minutes after the extraction vehicle had left. 17 minutes. The margin between an operation that succeeded and an operation that ended with an Israeli Kedon operative in Syrian detention was 17 minutes, yes, and that margin existed not because of precise planning, but because a road crew had taken an early lunch break and cleared their equipment from the alternate route 40 minutes sooner than their standard schedule. Nobody in the planning room had anticipated that. Nobody could have. The internal assessment of the operation, conducted 6 weeks after Aleph's return, classified it as a tactical success. Rahimi was dead. The weapons coordination network he had managed was disrupted. The specific transfer he had been facilitating, the threshold capability that had driven the hard deadline that had turned an 11-week planning exercise into an operational imperative, was delayed. The disruption lasted approximately 4 months. 4 months was not what the operation had been designed to produce. The planning case presented to senior Mossad leadership had projected a significantly longer disruption window, based on an assessment that Rahimi's role was sufficiently specialized that replacing him would require time, careful selection, and a period of institutional rebuilding within the Syrian Hezbollah coordination structure. That assessment was wrong. Not entirely wrong. There was a disruption. The 4 months were real. But the assessment had underestimated the depth of the existing coordination infrastructure, the degree to which Rahimi, despite being a critical node, had been operating within a system that had redundancies its architects had deliberately obscured from Israeli intelligence. A replacement coordinator was operational within 6 weeks of Rahimi's death. His identity was not fully established by Mossad until late 2009. By that point, a significant portion of the hardware Rahimi had been facilitating, the weapons system that Israeli military planners had considered the threshold item, the capability that had driven the entire operational timeline, had already reached its destination. It arrived in southern Lebanon in the spring of 2009. It is, according to open-source military assessments published as recently as 2023, currently deployed and operational. The weapons transfer Rahimi was coordinating was not stopped. It was delayed by the length of time it took to find someone to do what Rahimi had been doing. What that means, in the language that intelligence agencies use when they are being honest with themselves, is that the operation achieved disruption without achieving prevention. Those are not the same thing, and the resources consumed in achieving disruption, the planning hours, the technical development, the support network activation, the operational exposure incurred at every stage, were calculated against a projected outcome that the actual outcome did not match. L's 48-hour proposal had been rejected on the basis that it eliminated the highest probability window for target appearance. The target had appeared at hour 56, 8 hours beyond her proposed limit. The internal assessment noted this without drawing an explicit conclusion. The language used was careful and precise in the way that institutional language is careful and precise when it is trying to say something without being accountable for having said it. The operation succeeded within the approved 72-hour window. What the assessment did not say, and what L is reported to have noted in her own documented response to the assessment, was the question that the success had not answered. What would Aleph's judgment have looked like at hour 68? At hour 70? What was the actual condition of his cognitive function when he made the confirmation assessment at hour 56, and how close was that to the threshold she had been concerned about? The operation had worked. That did not mean the decision to override her limit had been correct. It meant the operation had worked. The support asset who had arranged the funeral cover, the man with legitimate access to local burial logistics whose cooperation had made the entire insertion mechanism possible, was arrested by Syrian intelligence 7 weeks after the operation. The circumstances of his arrest, reconstructed through later intelligence reporting, suggested that the connection to the cemetery was not the direct cause. A separate surveillance thread, unrelated to Rahimi, had flagged him through a documentation irregularity in a different operation entirely. He was held for 14 months. He did not, as far as available records indicate, disclose what he had arranged. What happened to him after his release is not in any file that has surfaced. Aleph returned to active status 8 weeks after Damascus. His next assignment was in a different country, a different method, a different target. His debrief file contains one passage that does not read like the standard operational language surrounding it. Asked whether he would accept this type of assignment again, he gave an answer that his debrief officer recorded verbatim because it did not fit any of the standard response categories. He said, "I would want to know, first, what the last one actually changed." There is no record of anyone answering him. The weapons system that Rahimi's death delayed by 4 months is currently positioned in southern Lebanon. The man who replaced Rahimi is still active. The cemetery in Damascus where this operation was conducted still receives burials several times a week. And somewhere in the institutional record of an intelligence agency that will never confirm this operation existed, there is an assessment that classifies what happened in that cemetery as a success. It achieved what it set out to achieve. What it set out to achieve just wasn't enough. If this operation raised questions you didn't have before you started watching, that's the only measure of this work that matters to us. Hidden Ops.